who is here after watching the second Enola Holmes movie and searching for some info about those match girls and their strike? I am.
Perhaps I should explain.
Some of what follows is true, the important parts at least. And yeah, well, Sherlock's younger sister is no less a fantasy than the detective genius of her elder brother. This story about the toxic phosphorus and the historic industrial action taken by women for women is true and extremely fascinating. So that's what actually happened in reality. The movie plot is presumably taking us to London in the late 1880s, where the young and ambitious detective, worthy of the Holmes name, gets involved in a case where strange things happen at the match factory which employs women workers. Not to drop heavy spoilers here, I'll just say that the case turns out to be more complicated than it seems, and Enola finds herself in the center of the riot for the rights of the female workers, which working and health conditions became heavily dependent on the ingredient they used to make matches of: the white phosphorus. Well, matches are certainly not a 19th century invention. Like many things we use in daily life, their prototypes were invented many centuries ago in China. Yet the process of their manufacturing was industrialized, if I may say so, in the 1830s. The production engineers added highly flammable white phosphorus to the end of the wooden stick. This combination proved to be highly reliable in use and cheap in production, which resulted in the fast commercialization of their production. The workers had a 14-hour working day, during which many of them were actually in charge of making those matches. They took the poplar or pine wood sticks and dip their heads into the toxic white phosphorus mixture. Then they had to dry up, and then the worker would pick them up, put in the matchbox. I'm not good at that. All of that while inhaling the fumes of those dangerous substances. Demand for matches was very high, and this way the matchmaking factory owners were making tons of money in this lucrative business. In contrast, the matchmaking workers themselves had to produce those matches in really poor working conditions for very little pay. They were expected to stand for the whole duration of their shifts, had to eat at their working places, and were allowed only to 2 bathroom breaks according to a schedule. Any digression from that, any talking or even accidental dropping of the matches, and they yelled at you, beat you, and charged you with constant fines. Many of those workers were women and young girls, some as young as 13 years old, who were coming from the first generation of Irish immigrants living in the poor East End neighborhood of London. Indeed, if you would combine poor living and working conditions of the lower classes and their deteriorating health, perhaps you won't be too surprised. Well, it's sadly rather what one might have expected back in those days. And indeed, the factory owners suggested that their health problems could be blamed on typhus or syphilis, in other words, anything but the substances they worked with at the factory. Yet, even in that situation, the scale of the growing health problems led some of them think that there was something going on there, and that the factory was just slowly killing them for the profit of the owners. One of the most dangerous things that happened to workers was called Phossy Jaw, the prosperous necrosis of the jaw. Think of a kind of cancer that took 3 to 5 years to finally debut its deadly consequences. Starting from a common toothache, in 6 months it completely destroyed the bone structure of the jaws, an extremely painful and at the end deadly condition for the human, especially if the infection would spread to the brain. In fact, they even tried to treat that by removing the lower jaw completely. Just think of the quality of life afterward. In fact, white phosphorus was notorious for being a reliable poison in previous centuries, although not as good for conspirators' purposes. The death cause could be detected post-mortem, since phosphorus has these glow-in-the-dark properties that were easily found in the victim's body. On the contrary, there was a great alternative for it, which was used up until the end of the 20th century. Agatha Christie exploited it heavily in her books, which both inspired criminals and saved people's lives. You may learn more about it in this video here. Interestingly, the first officially diagnosed Phossy Jaw dates back to 1839, and medical research papers on the potentially dangerous effects of phosphorus on the walker's health started circulating in the 1850s, more than 30 years before those series of strikes that slowly and painfully led to the complete ban of white phosphorus substance from the match-making production process. The Phossy Jaw is also connected to a nearly similar story of the Radium Girls. You may search for those horrifying details online, or let me know if you'd like me to make a video about it. The pivotal Match Girl strike campaign referenced in the Enola movie happened in 1888 at the premises of the Brian and May factory in London. Annie Besant was a working women's rights activist trying to reform these social inequalities. Her character was not mentioned in the movie. Perhaps some bits of her historic role were attributed to Tewkesbury, well, when he became their representative in government relations. Besant became interested in the case and came to the factory to help its workers fight for their rights. As a result of that first attempt, she produced a newspaper article exposing the factory owners to large social attention, which obviously infuriated them. However, they weren't so eager to lose their bloody dividends. As a reaction to that leakage of information, they fired those who, according to their investigation, spoke to Besant, and rest of the workers were forced to sign some statement that stipulated that the newspaper article was false and that they have no complaints to, in reality, appalling working conditions. Just like it was shown in the film, the majority was passive at first and agreed to that under threats of losing their jobs. Yet one of the girls didn't. As a result, she was sacked, yet luckily her co-workers realized the vital importance of her riot, and that's how the famous Match Girl strike began. In Enola, we meet the character of Sarah Chapman, who is shown as the leader of the protest. Indeed, just like her mother and her little sister, she was a factory worker and later became a prominent member of the union and one of the key figures of this match revolution. Yet obviously she wasn't alone. First, the 200 women left their working places and marched on the streets telling the press of their situation and their will to sue the factory owners. Then all 1,400 workers joined their strike. Some of them even spoke at the parliament, exposing the extreme poverty of their working classes and their heartless exploitation by the money-hungry factory shareholders. Alas, unlike in the movie, that was just the first step they had to take. That first strike did improve their working conditions. The owners agreed to get rid of those ridiculous fines, allowed them to eat in a separate room, and hired back those who were fired before. Yet that didn't change the whole situation with the deadly phosphorus, which was still used for those matches. Annie Besant continued her campaign, urging to switch to red phosphorus instead of white, since red one was also a very well-known version that was produced out of the heated white one. This additional transformation made it much less harmful for the workers. But why didn't the owners go for the red version right from the beginning? Well, the answer is pretty simple here. The red one was more expensive to make, and the notorious business owners didn't want to cut their margins. All that caused that famous match girl strike, which was, as it was said at the end of the movie, the first ever industrial action taken by women for women. It improved their working conditions forever. Well, at least it kickstarted the unionism movement and inspired others to follow them in their noble fight for their own rights. However, in reality, nothing changed overnight. In fact, Brian and May's factory continued to use white phosphorus for another 13 years, despite the ongoing pressure to switch to its safer version. At the same time, the story proves another notion from Enola film, that it only takes one flame to start a fire. Indeed, I was so positively surprised that the screenwriters included such important topics as the fight for women's and every person's rights and working conditions. And are we still exposed to phosphorus today? In fact, we are, yet it is the red phosphorus and is mostly located on the matchbox scratch surface and in really small amounts. But still, don't play with matches.